Hello and welcome to Classics Confidential. Today I'm at the University of Reading talking to Professor Vasunia about his new book, The Classics and Colonial India. Tell us about your project.
The book looks at the relationship between the classical tradition and India during the period of British rule. So it goes from about the 1750s. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is a conventional break point, to 1947, which is the date of Indian independence.
Right.
So it's looking at that roughly 200-year span.
Can I ask a controversial question? Do you think that the classics were used in a way as an imperial tool of oppression?
There definitely was some element of that. There's no way of denying that. And you could think of this in various ways. So, for example, there are Britons thinking of themselves as Romans, and there's an identification going on between Britons in India and Romans ruling their provinces. And we often find explicit statements by serving British officers and administrators who are referring back to ancient Rome or to the Romans. Or they might be quoting from Virgil, they might quote some Latin poetry or Horace, and we can see this very intimate connection that they feel with ancient Rome. So they're thinking of themselves as ancient Romans ruling an empire.
Yes, I mean, of course, the Victorian school system really sort of pushed the classics as a big sort of pedagogical tool. So it almost makes sense, doesn't it? That they, see themselves in relationship with antiquity.
Yes, I mean, it's not a coincidence that that period of the flourishing of classics in schools coincides with the age of empire. So you could say that there's a connection there, and that those two things, one could even suggest feed into each other. The study of classics, the study of ancient Greece and Rome, of Greek and Latin, feeds into, contributes to, facilitates even the British Empire, and vice versa. One could take the view that the British Empire provides a space in which the study of Greek and Latin can flourish, Greek and Roman studies can flourish, and flourish in a certain way, not just in some abstract way, but in a way that perhaps reflects back on empire.
And do you feel that India eventually reclaimed the classics, and if so, how?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, but the issue of a classic or the classic or classics in India is complicated by the fact that there is already in place an existing tradition, a literary tradition, a cultural tradition that goes back centuries in India. So there are traditions of Sanskrit literature, but also other literatures. And so when Britons arrived in India, they realized that there were these existing traditions, and that there was an existing classical Sanskrit tradition, for example. And they realized that they were coming into contact with a culture that had this ancient knowledge. And in that sense, you could say the British encounter with India is slightly different from the British encounter, say, with other parts of the world, where the British did not believe that the indigenous peoples had a historical tradition of its own. So in this sense, the British were prepared to acknowledge that there was a local tradition, an indigenous native tradition, or traditions that extended back several centuries. So that tradition of Indian learning coexisted with the teaching and propagation of Greek and Latin in India over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And one of the interesting things about this is that the notion of the classical, or the classics in India, is pretty broad at this time, especially in the first half of the 19th century. And the classical refers not just to Greek and Latin texts, but also to texts in Sanskrit, or to texts in Persian, or to texts in Arabic, or other languages.
So much broader concepts.
Exactly, there's a much broader conception of the classical, or the classics in this location, in this period.
But there is also a very, if you like, visible impact of the Greco-Roman classics in terms of, for example, architecture in India.
Yes, you can see the neoclassical style in buildings in India from the 18th century, at least from the 18th century onwards, and many of these buildings have now been destroyed, so one has to go on drawings and illustrations and discussions to recreate this lost chapter. But it wasn't just simply that these neoclassical buildings or monuments were set up in India. They were very self-consciously built by colonizers, showing Indians that this was a European architectural style. And so there was a message here for Indians, which is that we are bringing our own European classical culture, and these buildings are a representation or a manifestation of that culture. And within all of that, there was a lot of discussion about what architectural style or idiom was appropriate for South Asia. Should it be neoclassical or not? If it was neoclassical, what kind of classical traditions should be used? Should it be Doric or Ionic or Corinthian? These are questions that were being asked.
That's interesting. Those are quite specific
questions.
Yes,
and there's a textual record as well that accompanies this material culture, this visual culture, and there's a lot of discussion that we find about appropriate architectural style. There are also discussions about whether that classical idiom is appropriate at all.
At all, yes.
And whether Britain should be building in some other kind of style, or they should be following Indian styles of architecture.
How about in literature, in sort of political thought? Was there an impact that you can say, well, that's coming from sort of an ancient Greek or an ancient Roman model?
Yeah, we find this in various Indian authors. So there's an author called Henry Derozio, for example, who gets a lot of inspiration from the Greeks especially, but also the Romans. And he's getting some of his readings of ancient Greece via the Romantics. So Byron, Shelley, especially, also Keats. And he has a kind of romantic interest, a romantic passion for the ancient Greeks. And he gets swept up by the Greek War of Independence, as do Byron and others. And we see him writing poetry in imitation of Sappho, in imitation of Horace, in imitation of Byron, for that matter.
So in a way, the encounter is sort of mediated through British contemporary poetry.
Yeah, it's mediated through British Romantic Philhellenism. Yeah, and Derozio is one of these Philhellenes himself. But he's writing in Calcutta. He never leaves India. You know, he's never been to Europe. He's never been to England. He's never been to Greece. But he's reading stuff in Calcutta that he can get, and he's then trying to explore these questions in his poetry. He died at a very tragically young age, and so we don't have as much of his work as we might like to have.
So the encounter was unfortunately cut short.
Yeah, in his case it was.
How about in terms of politics, the sphere of politics? Was there any influence from ancient models, or in terms of philosophy?
Well, the most obvious example to bring up in that context is the figure of Gandhi himself. He tells us that he was inspired by Plato and the figure of Socrates, and he reads the Apology in South Africa. He translates this into Gujarati, then he translates it back, or gives us a version of the Apology in English. And this is happening in the early 20th century when he's still in South Africa. But he then comes back to India and he continues to bring up the example of Socrates as a model, as an inspiration, as a figure to aspire to. And Socrates is not his only model by any means. He had a whole range of figures and he looked up to. But Socrates is definitely an important figure for Gandhi. And there's also been a lot of discussion recently about Gandhi's relationship to the Stoics. And this is a subject that Richard Sorabji, for example, has discussed in his new book on Gandhi and the Stoics. So Gandhi is one example, a very major, important example of an Indian figure, political figure, spiritual leader, who takes his inspiration from Greek materials and Greek texts and then uses that to push forward his own agenda, his own program. So.
But it's wonderful, I mean, how many connections there are once you obviously start exploring the topic. Let's talk about another big project that you've got as the general editor of the Ancients and Moderns series. Tell us a bit about what drew you to the project.
Well, I was interested in the project because it was an opportunity to explore further this relationship between antiquity and the modern world, and to do it through a series of books on core subjects like race, gender, sex, the body, medicine, slavery, so on, politics, so on and so forth. And I thought that we could build up a solid contribution, solid series of explorations along these lines. And the series has been coming together very nicely. So it's published by Ivy Taurus in the UK and by Oxford University Press in the US. And it's a kind of joint publication agreement. And there have been 7 books released as of now, so where are we? April 2013. Yeah, and then there'll be a few more coming out this year, and there should be about 15 or so altogether. And then at that point, I think we're going to reassess and see whether we can continue, and if so, in what direction we should be going.
So it's about how these major concepts have changed from antiquity to the present, for example, gender.
Yeah, and the idea is both to compare and contrast views of gender, modern views with ancient views of gender, and also see how ancient conceptions of gender filter into modern theories and ways of thinking about gender. So you could compare a text like Plato's Symposium, for example, with some modern fictional explorations of gender, but also look at theoretical discussions from the modern period and compare those with discussions from antiquity.
Oh, what an exciting project to be involved in.
It's really come together very well. And we've been very lucky with the authors that we've had. So we've had some very good authors published in the series, and some very good ones whose works are forthcoming. So
excellent. Yeah. So watch this space.
Exactly. Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.